This presentation is on financing facilities renovation through the QSCB program by Matt Kimball. The QSCB program stands for the Qualified School Construction Bond Program. This program is not a state program, it is a federal program, and it was created by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. It allocated $11 billion for states and certain local education agencies, LEAs, in 2009, and another $11 billion in 2010. So it was a 2-year program for which school districts could apply for money, or for the ability to gain money. And although it's no longer providing funding or the chance to get funding, it is still being managed because of requirements associated with it. It doesn't provide direct money to school districts. What it does is it provides states with allocated bonds, and then states allocate those to school districts or bonds amounts. It is a federal tax credit program. So there's no direct funding, it provides tax credits. It provides tax credits by allowing school districts to sell a very specific type of bond to fund construction. Most bonds that school districts sell have interest rates associated with them. So the purchaser buys the bond to gain interest on their money, and that's how they make money off the bonds, and the school districts have to pay those interest rates. This program allows school districts to sell a bond in which they have either very, very low interest associated with them or even no interest rates associated with them. In exchange for the lack of interest that the purchaser gets, the owners of the bond receive tax credits on their federal income tax returns. So there's a kind of a win-win. The purchaser gets tax credits in exchange for no interest, and districts get money at a much cheaper rate to fund their construction. Because it is a federal program, there are federal laws associated with it, and this one is particularly associated with IRS laws and statutes. And the ones that govern this program are IRS codes 54A and 54F, as well as more information in notices from the IRS 2010-17, -28, and -35. The program also associated or limited some of the money. So instead of saying the $11 billion goes to all the states, have at it, it said 40% of the total bond limitation was allocated to the largest school districts. And the statute defined the largest school districts, or largest education agencies, as those with students ages 5 to 17 from families living below the poverty line. So that 40% went to about 100 different school districts or education agencies across the nation with the largest numbers of students, 5 to 17, living below the poverty line. In 2010, Department of Education Secretary Arnie Duncan added some school districts to those. He designated Marion County School District in Florida, Knox County School District in Tennessee, and Omaha Public Schools in Nebraska. So that added 3 more, so there were 103 total that got 40% of the total bond limitation. The remaining 60% then was allocated to the states. And Texas in 2009 received $538,585,000 in allocated bonds. In 2010, they received $547,674,000 in allocated bonds. The interesting thing, in 2009, the allocated amount was a little over $538 million, over $538 million, but the total amount that was allocated by the state was over $800 million. And the reason for the discrepancy was they initially allocated the $538,585,000, but some school districts didn't use their allocation, and that got returned. And so that money then got reallocated. So a little over $300 million was returned. So the total amount that ended up being allocated was over $800 million, but only $538 million was actually what was used, because that's what they really had. School districts have to apply and meet a stringent set of qualifications, including complying with the Davis-Bacon Act, making sure that they agree to arbitrage requirements, making sure that they meet all of the highest standards for construction as set by state and local governments as well as the nation. And then they also have to agree to spend 10% of the proceeds within the first 6 months and 100% of the proceeds within the first 3 years of issuance. So school districts couldn't just apply and say, okay, we have the money. They had to apply with an idea of how they were going to use it and begin using it immediately so that it got used appropriately. And that's why you saw some school districts having to return allocated amounts. The process does not require school board approval, although a prudent superintendent would make sure his school board was aware of the likelihood that they would apply. So while school board approval wasn't required, I know in Frisco they made sure the school board was aware of their discussions of whether they were going to apply or not, the ups and downs of the program, but it didn't require their approval. What does require their approval is if the bonds are allocated and the state says, okay, XYZ school district, you get a certain amount of bonds, then the school board would have to approve the issuing of those bonds before they could be sold. So school board approval is not required to apply, but would be required to issue the bonds. The application does require the superintendent's signature, however. The state then reviews that application, makes sure the district qualifies according to all the standards, and then determines what allocations the district receives. And there's different funding formulas that they use. The minimum amount is $5 million, and then it goes up from there. And if you look in 2009, $5 million was the lowest amount that was allocated to some school districts, and then the largest amount was about $55 million to Cypress Fairbanks. So that was kind of a range in Texas. And then once they receive that approval and the school board approves it, then they can issue the bonds. Proceeds from the sale of the bonds can go to, obviously, new construction, can go to the acquisition of land, with the caveat that a portion of the proceeds includes the building of the facility that goes on that land. So the school district couldn't just use the money to buy land only and wait. They had to buy land and then begin building on it within those first 3 years, because you had to use money for that. So there had to be purpose for it, and that's why some school districts were a little bit leery in 2009 to apply. It can also be used to rehabilitate public schools or repair them. And then also can be used to purchase new equipment that will be used in any new rehabilitated or repaired facility, so any new equipment. And then finally, a minor area would be that there's costs associated with issuing bonds, and the bonds that are sold, the proceeds from that can be used to take care of the issuing costs, not to exceed 2% of the proceeds. Budget coding wise, in talking with our school district, it sounds like that the bond proceeds go into a revenue code. So as you sell those bonds and receive that money, they're going to go into revenue code. And obviously, since this is tied to construction, they go into some sort of a construction coded revenue code. So for Frisco, that was coded as a 699 revenue code. And then as you begin spending money on the construction, the rehabilitation, or the improvements, then those funds come out of expenditure codes, and they are construction coded expenditures. So for Frisco, that was a revenue code coming in of 699 construction, and an expenditure as the money goes out coded as construction 699. Some of the benefits associated with the program is, like I said earlier, the purchaser gets federal tax credits, but the district gets to finance construction at little or even no interest, and that makes the financing side of construction cheaper for school districts. I think in our school district we got over $20 million from the QSCB program. We spend around $70 or $80 million a year on construction, and they said it saved us about $8 million in interest costs by going through this program. It also allows some districts a way to financially be able to afford improvements or construction of school facilities. For some school districts, it would be tough to be able to pay that interest. And by not having huge amounts of interest, then it makes it more feasible for them to rehabilitate or improve or construct new facilities. Some of the downsides is that you do have to pay it off quicker. You have about half the amount of time to pay off the bond, 16 years, as compared to the norm of about 30 years. But you got to remember, when you're selling normal bonds that you're paying principal and interest on, 30-year payments are going to equal what 16-year payments when you're only making principal payments on. So because you're not paying interest, the payments are about the same, but you do have to get it paid off in a quicker span of time. If you don't use the allocations, then you do have to return those to the state, so it's not like you get to hang on to those. And like I said, you have to manage and get that money spent within in 3 years. So as I said earlier, the program is no longer available to apply for it. The money's all been doled out. We're over, done. But they still are managing whether school districts are going to have that money spent within 3 years. So that'll go through 2012 or 2013. Not all school districts qualified. There was a lot of districts that were hesitant and leery of the program initially. And then as school districts kind of figured out that, hey, it's a pretty good program, more school districts applied in 2010 and 2009, and not as many were able to receive funds. So as a result of that, that's a downside. You also have to comply with arbitrage requirements and make sure that all subcontractors meet fair labor laws. So there's a layer of management that this provides or causes for school districts that isn't there normally. For more information, go to Texas Education's website, Texas Education Agency website, either under school financing or this direct website. And also the American Recovery and Reinvestment Tax Act of 2009's website is there as well to look up some of the different information.